going on, y'all? A lot better than last time I preached. I was really thinking to myself, I don't want to have to be like that guy that's always like, can I have a little more energy from you guys? So I'm excited to be back up here. I know many of you are thinking, we just got a head pastor. Why is the young guy up here again? But I'm glad you guys are having me. Kevin's on a little mini staycation, which I didn't know was a thing until not too long ago, but good for him. I am thrilled to be back up here. We're going to be continuing the series in Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, if you have your Bibles this morning. And originally, whenever I was assigned the passage, when Kevin and I sat down and kind of divvied up the passages, we settled on 7 verses 1 through 29. That's a lot. So, for those of y'all who know me, you know that I can't read 29 verses without getting distracted or chasing rabbits or going down wormholes, much less teach on it. So we're just going to go 1 through 6 this morning. And what I want you to do after today, after you go home, eat lunch, take your nap, watch World Cup, whatever you're going to be doing, just check out 7 through 29. It's not like I'm excluding that from this morning's teaching time. It's not like it's an inferior passage. I just felt like for the season that we're in at Legacy, for the time of year on through just where we are as a church, 1 through 6 seemed to fit a little bit better, and it was easy for me to kind of hunker down and teach 1 through 6 this morning. So let's get right into it. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It's better to go into the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For death is the destiny of every man. The living should take this to heart. Don't back out now. Just go. Continue with me, please. The heart of the wise is in the morning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of pleasure. It's better to heed a wise man's rebuke than to listen to the song of fools. Like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Okay. Here's the thing. I want you guys to fight the temptation this morning to back out because that's a wet blanket of a text. I want you to fight the urge to disengage because it's either too depressing, it mentions death too many times, or it mentions being sad too many times. What Solomon's doing here is not advocating sadness. He's not saying that laughter and happiness are bad. He's encouraging us to live. So this morning, as we split it up, I want you guys to really engage and see what the deeper meaning is this morning. More so, bigger than, that was a really depressing 6 verses. Cool? Got it. Right on. Perfect. They're so engaged once again. All right. Verses 1 and 2. We throw that back on the screen. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It's better to go into the house of mourning than to go into the house of feasting. For death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. The living should take this to heart. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I had like half a smoothie and a bottle of water and like 2 Dayquils this morning, so I'm feeling all kinds of trippy right now. So just bear with me if we get off on little tangents. But it says, a good name is better than a fine perfume. A good name is better than a fine fragrance. I think in North Dallas, we understand the fine fragrance culture. We understand the longing, the desire to smell good, to look good. And he's saying a good name is better than a fine fragrance. Whenever I was about 13 years old, I got into the age range of looking nice and smelling nice constantly. Like my goal was to always look nice and always smell nice. And you know, if you work with teenagers like I do, if you have teenagers, it's very difficult for a 13-year-old to A, look nice, and B, smell nice. And together, the two of those things are near impossible. But that was my goal on a day in, day out basis. So as a 13-year-old, I asked my parents for some smell good for Christmas. to have, like my first set of cologne and like body wash or whatever, I guess. So my parents, they like they always did, man, they found a way to make it happen for Christmas. So one day, Christmas break was just about to begin, and I had like 3 or 4 days left of school, and it was a Friday, and my parents were out on a date. And I knew where my parents hid their versions, their purchases of the Christmas stash, the Christmas gifts. I knew where the hiding spot was. So knowing that, and knowing that my friends and I are going to the movies later, I had one of two options: to go in and see if they had my smell, my fragrance, my smell good already purchased, or if they didn't. So I wandered in there and began to dig around, and sure enough, I found this deep oak scent that was smelled so bad that they had purchased for me. Knowing this, I had one of two options once again: to try it on and test it out, or to just wait until Christmas morning and act like I was surprised and then continue on with life being the best smelling human or 13-year-old around. I tried it on, I put it on, obviously, and I wore it to the movies and sat down next to the girl I had this huge crush on, an 8th grader, yeah, mind you, named Megan. I sat down next to Megan, and the first thing that she said, "You smell amazing." So I stuck my chest out and said, "Yeah, it's my fragrance. It's what I always wore. It's what I always wear." And the next Monday rolls back around, and my parents were already gone to work, and I had the responsibility of catching my ride to school. And then I once again had one of two options: to go to the closet, to put on my fragrance and go to school, or just to completely wait until Christmas to continue wearing my fragrance. I obviously opted for the former and began to wear it every day up until Christmas and through Christmas. Meaning, I opened up a gift that was 3/4 full. My parents weren't dumb, but decided to give me a pass. When I taught story, I continued to reapply the fragrance. I had to continue to reapply the fragrance. As good a smell as it was, which is debatable, the smell eventually faded away. The smell eventually left, and I had to go and reapply the fragrance the very next day, sometimes hours later, right? And Solomon here in Ecclesiastes 7 is saying that a good name doesn't fade away. A good name needs no reapplication. A good name is permanent, and it takes a lot of scrubbing, a lot of really hard, dirty work to rid yourself of a good name. It's better than a fine fragrance. He goes on in verse 2 to say, "It's better to go in the house of mourning than to go into the house of feasting. For death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart." He reminds us here in verse 2 that everybody dies. We're all going to die. Death is the destiny of everyone. And though it's kind of a really weird reality to think about, kind of a bummer, kind of weird that so many Americans force themselves not to think about it, Solomon reminds us that for death is the destiny of everyone. It doesn't matter when you're born, where you're born, how you eat, how you live. You're eventually going to pass. In 2007, my grandfather died, and he was the first member of my family who I was significantly close with. Both of my grandparents on my mom's side had passed before I was even born. So this was my first granddad, my closest pal, my homie, and he wasn't very kind to a lot of people, but chose to be kind to me. So in 2007, when he passed, man, I took it really, really hard, and I was super bummed out. I left college, came back home, went to the funeral, and hung out with family, and then each and every time I came back home from college and then on through my early years of adulthood, I would go and sit next to his grave. Go and sit graveside, and I wouldn't talk, I wouldn't pray, I would just sit and just breathe and just spend time there. It's kind of weird and morbid, but many of you probably have done something similar to this. I think American culture shies away and shuns death as something that's an ending or something that's awkward to talk about, but to experience death, to celebrate someone's life, doesn't just stop on the day you bury them. So as I got more comfortable out there, I began to look around and walk around, and I noticed so many headstones that said so many different things. Some were encouraging, some were just plain, some were happy, some were sad. Some were descriptive, some non, but the one thing they all had in common was the dash. They all had a dash. Meaning, they all had a point in time where this dash signified and symbolized this life that they lived. They had a birth date, a death date, and then this measly little mark to represent their life. I began to think, man, how will my dash be described? And Solomon here is not encouraging us to fear death, not encouraging us to dwell on death, but he's encouraging us to think about death to improve how we live our dash. To wake up every morning mindful of the fact that our dash counts and our dash will soon end. And that's what he's saying in verse 2 when he says, it's the destiny of everybody, but to go into the house of feasting isn't as nice to go into the house of mourning. For in the house of mourning, we cling to our promises a little bit tighter. We cling to our families a little bit tighter. I don't know about you, but when I find myself in time of desperations, I kind of gravitate towards the cross a little more. And he's saying, look, if we live this life of prosperity, we wouldn't know what success, what relief, what failure, or what true joy meant. Make your dash count. Let's begin to think of ways where we can improve our dash so when we leave this earth, people are still talking about our dash, not our death date. Verse 3 says, frustration is better than laughter because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. Before we go any further, I don't want you guys to think that laughter and pleasure and goodness and joyfulness are bad things. Psalm is not saying that these things should be shunned or should be forgotten about. He's saying that look, at the end of the day, he's advocating an appropriate contentment that isn't based on temporal circumstances. He's saying adversity creates growth and prosperity, not so much. Adversity creates growth. There's a guy by the name of Alfred Nobel who had the unique experience of reading his own obituary in the local paper. See, his brother died just days before, and so he woke up one morning, poured himself a cup of coffee, opened the newspaper, and began to read his own obituary. The local newspaper had gotten the wrong name, they had gotten the wrong brother, and they printed this entire obituary regarding Alfred, not his brother. So he read on and then quickly became kind of bummed out, kind of sad, because he realized that he was known and going to be known for creating dynamite. Creating dynamite, this tool used to blow through walls to sometimes destruct and unfortunately sometimes kill. He said, look, I don't want to be known for being directly associated with destruction. So at this point in his life, he had the opportunity to rewrite his dash. He began to raise money, to raise funds. He began to raise support and network for what we know now as the Nobel Peace Prize. Because he didn't want his life directly associated with destruction, but rather peace. Not just peace, but global peace. Peace so big that many and millions desire and strive to earn this award. So when we hear the name Alfred Nobel, Nobody thinks of dynamite. So my question this morning is, what if you woke this morning and you had the opportunity, this really unique experience of reading your own obituary? What would your obituary say? What would it be linked to? What would it be tied to? What would it point to? What would it say that you're passionate about? What would it say that you hated? What would it say that you loved? Would it just talk about those you left behind? Or would it talk about how you loved those that you left behind, that you supported those you left behind, that you not only loved and supported them, but you did everything that you could to prove your love for them? Would it say that you're a hard worker, you were known for being the first one in and the last one out, and that you deem that as a successful life, or that while you were the first one in, you were the last one out, your coworkers look to you for grace, hope, and love, for faith, hope, and love, for respect, but for a companionship, for truth? What would your obituary say about you? Would it say that you clung to your money and that you saved up so much that the generations below you could live a little more comfortably, they could have a nice gift when you're buried? Or would it say that you were free with your money, that you gave to those who were in need, and you looked for opportunities to give the money away that you so hardly worked for? What would your obituary speak and say about you? Selfishness, gracious. Love, hate. Verse 5, he says, it's better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. Like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Verse 6 says, like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. When I first read this, I was super confused and super weirded out. Like, what does the crackling of thorns under a pot even mean? Many of you in this room are much smarter than I am. You probably knew the direct correlation, but I had to do some digging. So I began to kind of Google this cultural term of like a crackling of thorns under a pot, and realized that back in the day and even nowadays, whenever a campfire needed to be restored or a quick fire needed to be had, whenever someone was cooking over or under a pot, they would throw a thorny bush onto the fire, and bushes with thorns on them tend to catch fire a lot quicker, and they tend to be super hot and then fade away very quickly. Branches of a thorn bush thrown on the fire will flame up quickly, but they don't last. It's hot, it's quick, but it doesn't last. And what Solomon here is saying is, when he says, like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. He's saying, look, to be surrounded by those who are going to laugh at you, to support you all the time, to be yes men, not laugh at you, but laugh with you, even though you don't necessarily deserve the laughter, it's meaningless. But the honest rebuke of a wise man, to be rebuked by somebody who loves you, or in Christian culture we say, speak the truth in love, is a good thing, he says. It's lasting. It's not just quick and hot, it's lasting. To be rebuked honestly stings. To be spoken to out of truth and love is a really hard thing to experience, and I'm really no expert at it, but I know that whenever I truly listen, it makes me a better person instead of being surrounded by those people who are going to constantly pat me on the back and tell me yes. Husbands, when your wife comes to you and honestly rebukes you whenever she calls you out for doing something that you and her both know that you've done wrong, how do you handle it? How do we handle it? With defense? Do we quickly get defensive and quickly begin to point our fingers back and say, well, you did this and you did this and you don't understand this, or I worked so hard, and we begin to start piling up the excuses for the reason that we acted this way? Or do we sit back and listen? Solomon here is saying, look, when you sit and you listen, when you're honestly rebuked, that makes you a better person and it improves your dash. Students, when your parents come to you and tell you why they're displeased with you, why they're upset with you, why they're unhappy with you, and why they're disappointed in you, they're not mad, they're just disappointed, right? How often do we just chalk it up to they don't understand us? They don't get us, they don't love us, they hate us, they're out to get us. But the fact of the matter is that Solomon's saying, when you stop and listen to those who love you like that, your dash becomes improved. You're living well. Or when our friends come to us and they call us out, when they hold us accountable towards something and hold something up in front of us and say, I don't think you really handled this well, how often do we quickly begin to think of the times where we could have called them out, but we didn't? And we're somehow a better person for that? An honest rebuke is better than a hot, quick fire, than yes men, so to speak. Who are you surrounding yourself with that's going to improve your dash, that will speak truthfully to you? Who in your life around you is willing to love you so much where they'll be completely honest with you instead of just letting you be comfortable and miserable in your own comfort? There's a guy by the name of Mickey Mantle. You may have heard of him. One of the greatest baseball players to ever live. And as a teenager in the Yankees farm system, he had a really, really hard time. Off the field, he couldn't relate to anybody. He was one of the youngest guys on the team. On the field, just couldn't figure it out. The speed of the game was just a little too much for him to handle. So he just was struggling and struggling and struggling. And finally called his dad and said, Dad, I need you to come pick me up. I'm tired of this. I can't do it. I'm quitting. So Mickey's dad got in the car and drove out to pick him up and remove him from his farm team. And as he picked him up and loaded Mickey up in the car, he said this following statement to him. He said, okay, let's go home. If that's all the guts you've got, let's go home. You might as well just come home with me right now and work in the mines. If that's all the guts you've got, Mickey Mantle, you might as well just come on home and work in the mines with me. The guy had talent, and he had every right to turn to his dad and said, I made it further than you did. I made a name for our town. I made a name for myself, and I gave my all and started listing excuses, but instead, he looked at his dad and said, you're right. Unloaded himself and went on to be one of the greatest baseball players to ever walk the face of the earth. Why? Talent, yes. But also, he had those around him who would speak honestly to him, who weren't going to pat him on the back when he didn't deserve it, who weren't going to be a yes man when he didn't deserve it, and to speak truth and love to him, to honestly rebuke him and say, if that's all the guts you've got, then come on home. How would you have handled that situation? When I think of that and the conversations that my dad and I had, man, I don't know if I would have been that gracious. But his graciousness paid off when he became one of the greatest ball players we've ever seen. I'm a big history buff, and I enjoy spending my time watching like old World War II documentaries and reading just historical novels. And I just read a book called Unbroken, which is an amazing, amazing story. And it talks about some Japanese pilots and some kamikaze pilots in the book. And I began to think about these kamikaze pilots for a while and thought, man, this is kind of a really weird concept. These guys who would load up and sit in this cockpit and then literally seal themselves in with no way out, with enough fuel for one trip to complete their destiny, so to speak. They began to ignore the consequences. They would die, and they felt like they would be worshipped and be war heroes and go on to live this amazing afterlife if they would have done this for their country. But they became so obsessed with the task at hand that they completely ignored the consequences, those they left behind, the remainder of life left to be had. And I kind of began to think about, man, how often do I truly get so caught up and so worried about the task at hand, be it paying bills, meeting a deadline, leading a group to New Orleans, and all the logistics and all of that, that I truly forget the big picture, that my dash matters more than that. My dash matters more than getting so worked up and yelling at my wife because I didn't get the bills paid on time, or honking at somebody in traffic on my way to work because they cut me off when I'm going to get there nonetheless. We have all these things distracting us from our ultimate calling, from living a dash worthwhile. We have things that distract us from about it: work, family, deadlines, bills, debt, and relationships. But hear this. I truly believe failing to think about death, like Solomon's encouraging us to do in this text, means failing to think about life. When we completely ignore death and that this ride will one day end, we're forfeiting the right to think about living life well. To improve our dash means to think about the end. To improve our dash means surrounding ourselves with those who love us enough to be honest with one another. To improve our dash means it's better than just smelling nice and looking nice and looking pretty and looking well put together. Failure to think about death is a direct correlation of failure to think about life. And the one thing I tell my students every week in, week out, is that true joy is directly dependent on full obedience. In order to experience true joy, in order to experience joy that goes beyond all understanding, we must fully obey. It's directly dependent on full obedience. And to obey means to live a life worth talking about. To live a dash that means something more than just a line across a headstone. Failure to think about death is failure to think about life. Let's pray real quick. Father, as we kind of maneuver through this awkward text and talk about death and talk about sadness and heartache and failure, and we tend to kind of get to sink in our chairs and to be a little bit more miserable and feel a little bit sorry for ourselves. And I truly believe that Solomon in this passage, in this specific portion of Scripture, was not intending to bum anybody out, but rather to encourage us to think about our destiny and what that means. That it goes beyond just working hard and playing hard. It goes beyond just saving a lot of money. It goes beyond just making a lot of money, but to truly hold on to the ones we love, to truly surround ourselves with the ones who love us. And then when we go into the house of mourning, when we go into the house of feasting, that we nevertheless cling to your promise that you give us true joy, that you give us a fervor and excitement for life that nothing can ever replace. Nothing can ever compare to, nothing can ever be mentioned with. Lord, so my prayer in this moment over these people, over myself, over this band, is that we would begin to think about the end of our dash, the end of our ride, and let that affect the remainder of it. If we continue to ignore what our destiny is, and that is death, then we're ignoring the fact that we have a say in improving our dash. Let us not be so consumed with looking nice and smelling nice, so to speak, and just living a raw life worthy of your call to go and make disciples, to live a life full of faith, hope, and love. So, Father, in this moment, as we continue to worship, I just pray that we would worship with that in mind, that we would worship with that fact in mind, that you have called us to live well here so that may we live well with you one day. And that we would have that at the forefront of our minds to affect our relationships, to saturate our relationships, to let us cling to those relationships and love one another well while we can, while we have one another on this earth. Thank you for sobering texts like Ecclesiastes 7. And though they're not easy to preach and they're not easy to talk about and not easy to teach and preach on, Lord, They're sure as heck convicting, and I'm thankful for that I can teach and read a living word. We love you. It's in your son's name. Amen.